The desert wind howled through the streets of Silver City, New Mexico, carrying the smell of dust, whiskey, and gun oil. Somewhere in that forgotten corner of the American frontier, a scrawny teenage boy was learning that life didn't offer mercy to anyone without power or a gun. His name was Henry McCarty, though the world would remember him by another, Billy the Kid. Born around 1859, no one could ever quite agree on where he came from. Some said New York, others swore it was Indiana. What everyone did know was that his father vanished early, leaving his mother, Catherine, to raise him alone. She worked wherever she could, washing clothes, cooking for miners, anything to keep the boy fed. Billy adored her. She was his whole world. But in the Wild West, the world had a cruel habit of taking away the few good things a person had. When Catherine died of tuberculosis in 1874, Billy was just 14, alone, hungry, and angry. At first, he tried to survive honest. He swept floors, tended horses, did odd jobs for pennies. But the West didn't care for honest boys. The hunger got worse, the nights colder. Then came the day he stole a bundle of laundry from a Chinese shop to trade for food. A stupid, desperate act. The law caught him, locked him in a cell barely big enough to lie down. And that S, where Billy made his first real decision as a man. He wouldn't rot behind bars for a crime born out of hunger. He escaped that night, slipping through the chimney like smoke, and vanished into the desert. From that moment on, Henry McCarty was gone. In his place rode Billy Bonney, a boy with a revolver and no place to call home. For a time, he drifted. He worked ranches in Arizona, rode with cowhands and gamblers, and learned the language of guns. The frontier was a hard teacher, but Billy was a fast learner. He was light, quick, charming in his own rough way, the kind of kid who could smile while cheating you at cards or talk his way out of a hanging. But fate caught up soon enough. In 1877, a saloon argument in Camp Grant turned bloody. A blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill called Billy a thief and shoved him to the ground. Laughter erupted around the room. Billy's face went red, his pride hotter than the Arizona sun. When Cahill lunged again, Billy drew his revolver. One shot, straight to the gut. Cahill fell dead. Billy stood over him, his hands shaking, whispering to himself, "I didn't mean to," but there was no taking it back. In a single heartbeat, a scared boy had become a killer. From that day, there was no going home. He fled east into New Mexico territory, riding under false names, sleeping in barns, hiding in canyons. Every wanted poster added to his legend: Billy Bonney, the Kid, the boy who shot a man twice his size. Yet behind that growing reputation was still just a kid who laughed too easily, who whistled songs his mother once sang. Locals said he could charm a rattlesnake, that he treated his horse better than most men treated their wives. He didn't drink much, didn't brag, but when he pulled that gun, lightning. One old rancher remembered. He wasn't mean, not at first, just quick, too damn quick for his own good. By 1878, Billy found himself in Lincoln County, New Mexico, a place ripe with tension and greed. Ranchers, traders, and mercenaries all clawed for control of the land. Billy tried to lay low, working cattle for a British rancher named John Tunstall, one of the few decent men he'd ever met. Tunstall treated Billy like a son, giving him work, trust, and dignity. For the first time in years, Billy had something like a family. But in the West, peace was just the pause before the next gunshot. The county was ruled by two rival factions: the Murphy-Dolan gang, backed by corrupt lawmen, and the Tunstall-McSween outfit, who stood for fair business. When Murphy's hired guns murdered Tunstall in cold blood, something broke inside Billy. He knelt beside the body of the only man who'd ever shown him kindness and swore an oath under his breath. They'll pay for this, every last one. That night, he saddled his horse, checked the bullets in his Colt, and rode into the darkness. The boy who'd once run from the law now rode straight toward it. The following months turned Billy from a fugitive into a soldier of vengeance. He joined a group of ranch hands and loyalists who called themselves the Regulators, men bound not by law, but by revenge. Their mission, to bring Tunstall's killers to justice. And justice, in Lincoln County, came at the end of a gun barrel. Billy's first kill as a regulator came at dawn in a canyon outside Blazer's Mill. The air was cold, the ground hard. A lawman named Buckshot Roberts refused to surrender. The firefight lasted all morning. When the smoke cleared, Roberts was dead, and so were 2 regulators. Billy had been shot through the thigh, limping but alive. The newspapers started printing his name again. Billy the Kid, the boy outlaw. Each time they said it, the legend grew, and so did the price on his head. As the Lincoln County War exploded, Billy's loyalty became both his weapon and his curse. He fought for the memory of Tunstall, for friends who died beside him, for a sense of justice that no longer seemed real. Some nights he'd sit by the fire staring into the flames. By late 1878, Lincoln County was burning, literally. Rival gangs torched buildings, ambushed each other in the streets. The Kid was at the heart of it all, fast, fearless, and impossible to catch. When bullets flew, he didn't flinch. When friends fell, he buried them himself. Some said he fought for revenge. Others said he fought because there was nothing left worth believing in. The truth was somewhere in between. A boy chasing the ghost of justice across a land that didn't believe in it anymore. As autumn rolled across the desert, Billy stood atop a ridge overlooking the Lincoln Valley. Below him, smoke curled into the evening sky. Another ranch burning, another score settled. He holstered his gun and watched the horizon turn red. Somewhere deep down, he wondered how many more sunsets he'd lived to see. But he didn't dwell on it long. The Kid never did. He turned his horse toward town, his shadow stretching long against the dying light. The legend of Billy the Kid was just beginning, and the West had no idea what kind of storm it had created. Closing narration. He wasn't born bad. The frontier made him that way. A boy without a home, chasing justice through the dust. His name was Billy the Kid, and America would never forget it. The spring of 1878 burned hotter than usual in New Mexico, and the tension in Lincoln County was ready to explode. Dust hung in the air like smoke from 1,000 unseen fires, and in that haze rode a young man barely 18, already carrying more ghosts than years behind him. Billy the Kid had drifted into Lincoln looking for honest work, but what he found was a war that would carve his name into the bones of the West. The county was split clean down the middle. On one side stood the Murphy-Dolan faction, corrupt merchants backed by lawmen who sold badges for whiskey. On the other side were John Tunstall and Alexander McSween, idealists who believed in fairness and decency, 2 words that didn't survive long in frontier towns. Billy worked for Tunstall, tending horses and guarding cattle. For the first time in years, someone treated him like more than a runaway. Tunstall gave him food, a roof, and respect. It was enough to make Billy think maybe there was still good in the world. That illusion died the day Murphy's men ambushed Tunstall on a lonely road. Billy was just a mile away when he heard the gunshots echo through the canyon. When he reached the scene, he found his boss sprawled in the dust, eyes staring blankly at the endless blue sky. Billy knelt beside him, his fingers trembling as they touched the blood-soaked dirt. "If the law won't punish them," he whispered, "then I will." From that moment, Billy became something else entirely. He and a handful of loyal men, ranch hands, misfits, friends, formed a group they called the Regulators. They swore to hunt down Tunstall's killers and deliver justice, whatever it took. They weren't outlaws, not yet, but they were already beyond redemption. Their first act came swiftly. At dawn, Billy and the regulators surrounded the small farmhouse where Sheriff Brady and his deputies, the men responsible for Tunstall E.'s death, were holed up. The air was cold, the sun just a faint glow behind the hills. Billy's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. When the sheriff stepped out into the street, Billy fired. 2 shots cracked like thunder, and Brady fell dead in the dust. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the world rushed back in. The screams, the smoke, the sudden heavy weight of what he'd done. Billy had crossed a line, and there was no way back. From that day forward, the papers called him a killer. But among the poor ranchers and cowhands of Lincoln, he was a folk hero, a boy who dared to strike back against the powerful. The Lincoln County War spread like wildfire. Ambush followed ambush, revenge followed revenge. Billy's legend grew with every gunfight. Some said he could hit a coin tossed in the air. Others swore he never missed his mark. The truth was simpler. He was fast, fearless, and desperate, and that made him deadly. Yet despite his rising fame, Billy remained human. He joked with his friends, sang around the campfire, and played cards with a grin that made people forget he was wanted for murder. But when he was alone, he stared into the flames, his face lit with the flicker of doubt. "We're all gonna die for nothing," one of the regulators said one night. Billy shook his head. "Maybe," he replied, "but at least they'll know we tried." As the war dragged on, both sides grew more ruthless. Ranches burned, bodies piled up, and Lincoln turned into a graveyard. The regulators were hunted by the very law that had protected their enemies. Every town they entered, bounty hunters followed. Every night, Billy slept with one eye open and his gun beside him. But even as his friends began to fall, Charlie Boder, Dick Brewer, and others, Billy refused to stop. "They can call me an outlaw," he said, "but I'll never be a coward." Still, the cost was high. Each gunfight left him colder. The boy, who once smiled easily, now spoke little. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something harder, emptier. He wasn't fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting because it was all he knew. By the summer of 1879, the war had burned itself out. Murphy was ruined, McSween was dead, and Lincoln was a wasteland of charred buildings and silent streets. The regulators scattered to the wind. Billy was alone again, his friends buried in unmarked graves, his name on every wanted poster in New Mexico. One evening, he rode to the edge of town and watched the sun sink behind the blackened hills. The light turned the sky the color of blood. He thought of Tunstall, of his mother, of the boy he used to be before the gun became his only truth. For the first time in a long while, he felt tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from riding or fighting, but the kind that seeps into the soul. He pulled a crumpled photograph from his pocket, the one of his mother he'd carried since childhood. Her smile was fading with age, the edges of the picture worn thin. "Mama," he whispered, "I tried to be good, but there ain't no good out here." He tucked the photo back into his coat and turned toward the sound of horses in the distance. A posse was closing in, men paid to bring him in dead or alive. Billy smiled faintly. "Guess it's time to ride again." He mounted his horse and disappeared into the desert night, a ghost chased by the sins of his own making. Behind him, the flames of Lincoln flickered in the darkness like dying memories. The war had ended, but the legend was just beginning. Somewhere out there, a new sheriff was waiting, a man named Pat Garrett, who would one day be both his friend and his executioner. But that was still ahead. For now, Billy the Kid rode on beneath the endless stars, young, reckless, and doomed, a boy who tried to be a hero in a world that only made killers. The Lincoln County War was more than just a local feud. It was a storm born from greed, power, and vengeance that swept through the heart of New Mexico. By the spring of 1878, Billy the Kid had already chosen his side, not because of politics, but because of loyalty and survival. He had sworn allegiance to John Tunstall, the English rancher who treated him not as an outlaw, but as a son. When Tunstall was murdered by a posse loyal to the Murphy-Dolan faction, something inside Billy snapped. From that day forward, it was no longer about law or land. It was about revenge. Lincoln County became a powder keg, and Billy was holding the match. He and a small group of young gunmen formed the Regulators, men bound together by blood oaths and a shared thirst for justice. They rode with cold fury, their faces hardened by the desert wind, their eyes set on those who had taken Tunstall's life. Within weeks, the Regulators made their move. They ambushed Sheriff William Brady, one of the men they believed responsible. The gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Lincoln like the judgment of God. Brady fell dead, riddled with bullets, and Billy's name was now whispered across New Mexico. Some called him a hero, others a murderer. The law called him a fugitive. The legend had begun to take shape. As the violence escalated, the line between vengeance and justice blurred until it vanished entirely. The Regulators became hunted men, driven from one hiding place to another. The war turned Lincoln into a ghost town. Burned-out homes, bullet holes scarring the adobe walls, families fleeing into the desert. The U.S. Army was sent to restore order, but by then, order was just a memory. Billy, once a farm boy looking for a chance at a decent life, now led a band of desperados whose names would be etched into the annals of outlaw history. Doc Scurlock, Charlie Boder, Tom O'Folliard, and others who rode into the storm knowing it would likely be their last. But amidst the chaos, there was something magnetic about Billy. Even his enemies admitted he had charm. That crooked grin, that lightness in his speech that made you forget, for a moment, the blood on his hands. To some, he represented the dying spirit of the Old West, defiant, reckless, unwilling to bow to the powers that be. The Lincoln County War reached its brutal climax in July 1878. Lincoln became a war zone. The Regulators barricaded inside the McSween house, surrounded by Murphy's men and soldiers. For 5 days, bullets tore through the walls. Smoke and heat filled the rooms, screams pierced the night. Billy fought like a man possessed, firing through cracks in the walls, darting through the flames. When the house finally caught fire, it was over. McSween was shot dead as he tried to surrender, and the Regulators scattered into the darkness. Billy escaped through a hail of gunfire, vanishing into the hills. The war had ended, but the blood on his hands would never wash away. The aftermath left Lincoln County broken and bitter. The powerful grew richer, and the weak buried their dead. Billy had lost friends, mentors, and any chance at redemption, but he wasn't ready to fade away. In the months that followed, he drifted across New Mexico, a ghost of the desert, robbing to survive, laughing in the face of death. Newspapers began to print his name, Billy the Kid, as if he were more myth than man. The legend grew with every story told around a campfire, every whispered tale in a saloon. Yet behind that legend was still a young man, barely 20, who had seen too much death for a lifetime. He longed for freedom, maybe even forgiveness, but the world had already decided his fate. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer Henry McCarty or William Bonney. He was a killer, a symbol of everything the frontier was trying to bury. Still, deep down, Billy carried a strange sense of honor. He never killed without cause, or so he told himself. Maybe it was his way of holding on to whatever humanity he had left. The war had made him, but it had also destroyed him. And somewhere in the desert wind that swept across Lincoln's empty streets, the whispers of his name began to fade, not as a criminal, but as a legend carved into the bones of the West. By 1879, the war in Lincoln County had burned itself out, but the embers still smoldered, in the soil, in the people, and in the soul of one young outlaw who refused to die. Billy the Kid was now a wanted man, his name plastered on posters across New Mexico territory, $500 reward, dead or alive. He was barely 20, yet his legend already rode ahead of him like a dust storm. To some, he was a Robin Hood of the desert, stealing from the rich, helping the poor, standing against the corrupt. To others, he was nothing more than a killer with a boy-s smile and a devil-s luck. The kid drifted through the frontier like a ghost. He rode from one dusty town to another, Fort Sumner, Las Vegas, White Oaks, always one step ahead of the law, always laughing in the face of danger. The lawmen chasing him called him reckless, but those who rode beside him said he was fearless. He could shoot a man dead before most could draw. But it wasn't just his skill that made him untouchable. It was his charm. Billy had a way of talking his way out of death. Women adored him, children idolized him, and even some sheriffs couldn't help but respect him. He played guitar, told jokes, danced in saloons, and never lost that mischievous twinkle in his eye, even when there was blood on his boots. Still, behind that grin was exhaustion. Every dawn brought another escape, every night another betrayal. The Lincoln County War had taken his friends, his peace, and maybe even his soul. The kid found new companions, Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Boder, and others who shared his fate. But one by one, they too would fall. He knew it was only a matter of time before his luck ran dry. But until then, he lived like every sunrise was his last. One of the men tasked with bringing Billy in was Sheriff Pat Garrett, a tall, calm man who once drank and laughed with Billy in the same saloons. They had been friends once, bound by the rough brotherhood of the frontier. But now, Garrett had the badge, and Billy had the price on his head. Their paths were destined to collide. Garrett's campaign against the kid was relentless. He hunted him across the mesas and canyons, through storms and silence, following tracks that disappeared in the dust. Billy, always cunning, always smiling, seemed to slip through his fingers at the last second. He'd vanish into the night, reappear in another town, rob a stagecoach or steal a horse, then melt back into the desert. It became a dance between hunter and hunted, two men who knew each other too well to underestimate the other. As the months dragged on, the myth of Billy the Kid grew. Newspapers called him the Prince of Outlaws. Some claimed he could shoot the wings off a fly. Others swore he could charm a snake out of its skin. But the truth was far more human. Billy was tired. The endless chase had turned him into a man running not just from the law, but from his own past. He'd wake in the middle of the night, haunted by the faces of those he'd killed, and by the ones he couldn't save. The laughter came less often, the smile faded quicker, but he still rode on because stopping meant dying. Then came the ambush near Stinking Springs. Garrett and his posse caught up to Billy's gang in the freezing dawn. Gunfire tore through the air, horses screamed, bullets shattered the silence. When the smoke cleared, Billy's friend Tom O'Folliard lay dead, and the rest were captured. The kid slipped away once again, wounded but alive, his defiance burning brighter than ever. But he knew it couldn't last. The frontier was shrinking, civilization closing in, and men like Billy had no place in the world that was coming. By December 1880, Pat Garrett cornered him once more at Fort Sumner. This time, there was no escape. Billy was captured, tried for the murder of Sheriff Brady, and sentenced to hang. The outlaw who had cheated death so many times was finally facing the end. And yet, even in chains, he kept that grin, the same boyish spark that had carried him through the blood and dust. When a reporter asked if he feared the noose, Billy smirked and said, "I've cheated death before. Maybe I'll do it again." For a moment, it seemed like the West had won. The kid was in custody, the legend about to end. But Billy wasn't done writing his story. Somewhere deep in his heart, he knew he wasn't meant to die in a courtroom. Not yet. The world still owed him one last escape, one final blaze of glory that would make his name eternal. And when that day came, it would shake the frontier to its very core. The spring of 1881 settled over New Mexico like a cruel joke. Warm sun, soft wind, and the shadow of the gallows waiting for Billy the Kid. Locked inside the Lincoln County courthouse, he sat in his cell with iron around his wrists and death waiting just a few weeks away. The sentence was clear. He would hang on May 13th for the murder of Sheriff Brady. But anyone who truly knew Billy knew he wasn't the kind of man to die quietly. The guards underestimated him. They always had. To them, he was just a cocky boy with a fast draw and quicker tongue. They forgot that the kid had survived wars, manhunts, and betrayals that would have broken any other soul. He still had that glint in his eye, that restless spark that refused to fade. He joked with the locals, played cards with the guards, smiled at the ladies who came to stare at the famous outlaw behind bars. But behind that grin, his mind was racing. Every day, every hour he was planning. The courthouse was his prison, but it was also his map. He studied every sound, every routine, every careless step. His chance came on April 28th. The sheriff, Pat Garrett, was out of town. Only 2 deputies, James Bell and Bob Olinger, watched over him. Bell was young and nervous, the kind of man who can follow orders but lack the steel to face a killer. Olinger, on the other hand, was cruel. He taunted Billy every day, calling him a dead man walking, bragging about the shotgun he kept loaded with buckshot just for him. Billy never forgot that. That morning, Bell led Billy up the stairs to the privy. Billy's hands were cuffed, but he'd somehow loosened the chain earlier with a hidden piece of metal. As Bell turned his back, the kid moved like lightning. In one fluid motion, he slipped free, wrestled Bell's gun away, and fired. The shot echoed through the courthouse. Bell stumbled, clutching his chest, and fell down the stairs. Billy froze for half a second, not out of guilt, but instinct. Then the outlaw took a deep breath, grabbed the keys, and unlocked his irons. Freedom was just a few steps away. Olinger heard the gunshot from across the street and came running, shotgun in hand, his prized weapon, the one he always bragged about. Billy grabbed that same shotgun from where Olinger had left it, leaning against the wall. As Olinger burst through the door, Billy leaned out the window above and called down, "Hello, Bob." When Olinger looked up, the kid pulled both triggers. The blast hit him square in the chest, throwing him backward onto the dusty street. Billy smiled, almost sadly. "You're a good man, Bob," he said quietly. "Guess you won't need that gun anymore." Within minutes, the courthouse was in chaos. Townsfolk screamed, doors slammed, horses panicked. Billy moved quickly, reloading his weapon, cutting the telegraph line and grabbing whatever ammunition he could find. He knew Garrett would hear about this soon. Maybe he already had. And that meant he had little time. He found a horse, saddled it fast, and rode out of Lincoln just as the sun began to set. The people who saw him later swore he looked like a ghost riding out of hell, small, wiry, his hat low, his smile wide. For days, the kid disappeared into the wild. The whole territory buzzed with his escape. Newspapers called it a miracle of outlaw cunning. Some said he flew like a spirit, others claimed the devil himself helped him. But the truth was simpler. Billy had the nerve to do what no other man dared. He turned death into a game and won. He rode to Fort Sumner, where his friends still hid, though the old gang was shattered. The war had taken too many. Tom O'Folliard was dead, Charlie Boder too. The frontier was changing. The railroad, the ranchers, and the law were pushing the old life away. Billy knew it, but he refused to surrender. He still believed there was room in this world for men like him, wild hearts who wouldn't kneel to anyone. But in quiet moments, under the stars, something inside him began to ache. The thrill of running, the joy of cheating death. It no longer felt like freedom. It felt like loneliness. He had no home, no future, only the endless chase. Some nights he dreamed of riding south into Mexico, starting fresh under another name, maybe even finding peace. But deep down he knew fate wouldn't let him. Men like Billy the Kid weren't meant for long lives. They were meant for stories, the kind that live forever, told in whispers and gunfire. Back in Lincoln, Pat Garrett swore he would bring him in once and for all. To Garrett, it wasn't about friendship anymore. It was about duty, about the legend that was swallowing them both. Billy's escape had humiliated him in front of the entire territory, and there was only one way to fix that. So, as Billy rode beneath the moonlit desert sky, laughing softly to himself, Garrett was already in pursuit, cold, silent, patient. The two men were bound by destiny, drawn together like shadow and flame. And though Billy didn't know it yet, the end of his long, bloody ride was already waiting for him in Fort Sumner. The summer air of July 1881 hung thick over Fort Sumner, hot and still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Billy the Kid had returned to the only place that ever felt like home, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. He had friends there, a few women who still smiled when they saw him, and nights filled with laughter and guitar music. For a brief moment, it was as if the world had forgotten he was a fugitive. But death was already on the road to meet him, wearing the face of an old friend, Pat Garrett. Garrett and his deputies arrived quietly on the evening of July 14th. They knew Billy was somewhere in the house of his friend Pete Maxwell. The moon was hidden behind clouds, the air heavy with silence. Inside, Billy sat at a nearby ranch house, talking with a friend, unaware that fate was just a few minutes away. When he heard voices outside, he rose, curious. His instincts told him something was wrong, but he couldn't help himself. He slipped his revolver into his belt and walked toward the sound. The night was so dark he could barely see. He stepped into Pete Maxwell's room, the floor creaking beneath his boots. Garrett was already there, sitting quietly in the shadows, waiting. Billy, startled by the figure in the dark, spoke softly in Spanish. "¿Quién es?" "Who is it?" There was no answer. He took another step forward. "¿Quién es?" he repeated, his hand brushing the handle of his gun. Garrett recognized the voice immediately. In that heartbeat of silence, years of friendship, betrayal, and destiny collided. He raised his pistol, the barrel glinting faintly in the dim light, and fired once. The bullet struck Billy just above the heart. He fell back, gasping, a soft sigh escaping his lips. The boy, who had cheated death so many times, finally lost. He died before he hit the floor, still clutching his revolver, never even firing a shot. For a long moment, no one moved. Garrett stood in the dark, his hand shaking. He'd done his duty, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like an ending, not just for Billy, but for everything the West had been. Outside, the desert wind rose, carrying dust and silence through the town. Someone whispered, "He's gone." The kid was 21 years old. Word of his death spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the country printed the story, and within days, Billy the Kid became larger than life. The outlaw who laughed at the hangman, who rode faster, shot truer, and lived freer than any man before him. Some mourned him as a folk hero, others cursed his name, but everyone remembered. In the years that followed, stories spread that he hadn't really died, that he'd escaped once again, riding south into Mexico to live under a new name. People claimed to have seen him in Texas, Arizona, even as far away as South America. The myth refused to die because legends never do. Billy had become more than a man. He was a symbol of the untamed West, the last spark of freedom in a world being swallowed by law and order. Pat Garrett never escaped the shadow of that night. Some praised him as a hero, others called him a traitor. The money he earned from killing Billy barely lasted, and the fame brought him nothing but regret. He'd look out across the desert and say quietly, "I did what I had to." But deep down, he knew. Some ghosts never stop riding beside you. As for Billy, the kid lives on. In the songs of cowboys, in the campfire stories told under the stars, in the hearts of those who still dream of a world where men ride free. He was reckless, violent, and flawed, but he was also brave, defiant, and alive in ways most men never are. The West was changing, but Billy refused to change with it. And maybe that is why we still remember him, because he represents the wild part of ourselves that refuses to be tamed. The desert remembers him. The wind still whispers his name. And every time someone picks up a guitar, tells a story about an outlaw, or rides into a sunset without looking back, Billy the Kid rides again. So, if his story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and keep riding with us across the dust and blood of the American frontier. Because this isn't just history, it's legend. And legends like Billy the Kid never die.